things done. And when we looked out in the world, and I spent time trying to figure out, well, what is this all about? You know, I saw that there were a lot of books that had been written about creativity, many, many good books about creativity. There's some really good books about execution, too. In fact, Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan wrote a book on execution called Execution, and you should check it out. It's a great book about how to get things done. But we're not that many people talking about this first trait, talking about this idea of empathy and why that matters to growth. So I want to spend time talking to you about cases of why empathy can actually drive a business to succeed and prosper, and hopefully in doing so, we'll see within it the keys for making a corporation a better citizen as well, and being more socially responsible to all of its stakeholders. Now, empathy is something that all of you understand, and not just because you are involved in corporate citizenship, but because you are human beings. Right? We are all born with this ability to connect with other people. And empathy is the ability to step outside of ourselves and walk in someone else's shoes, to really feel what they're feeling and to understand their point of view. Right? And doing that allows you to see things that other people don't see. If you're able to step outside of the conditions that you're in, you may see opportunities faster than other people. And because I'm a consultant, I try to tell stories in the form of business cases. And this is one example of something that we tell fairly early on in the book. It's something that's related to Microsoft, who I also noticed is the sponsor of this conference and of this organization. But Microsoft, you may recall back in the mid-90s, was in a pretty sweet position, right? They had spent the last 15 years kind of pummeling the heck out of people like IBM and Apple for dominance of personal computers. And they kind of owned that space. And then they suddenly woke up and realized that there was another threat that they hadn't been paying attention to. And that threat was irrelevance. You see, right around that same time, Sony had announced that they were going to be launching something called a PlayStation 2. And the PS2 was a game console. It was a video game console, but it was unlike any video game console that had come before it. Up until that point in time, video games were really just that. They were toys for kids to play with. But this thing was going to be different. This was going to be a console where you could, watch DVDs, so you could watch movies on it. And it was going to have a way to connect to the internet, so you could browse the web on this thing. And it really suggested that you didn't need to have a personal computer at all. You could just spend time in the comfort of your living room and actually spend time away from all that nasty Windows stuff that Microsoft was making. And this scared Microsoft to death, and they knew they needed to do something about it. And so they decided to act. And you can understand that a company trying to do something completely different is a huge challenge. Microsoft is a software company. They knew nothing about hardware. And Microsoft knows everything about the office and about work, but they didn't know much about play. And they looked and they said, we have to figure out a way around this. So they decided to break the rules. They got together a group of people who were not traditional Microsofties. These were people, many of whom had come from outside the company. And they told them, you don't have to follow the Windows standard. You don't have to make this thing something that we can, use PowerPoint on. But just come up with something that's going to give Sony a run for their money. And these folks knew exactly what they wanted to do, because they were huge hardcore video game fans. They loved to play video games. And they didn't just love to play, any kind of video game. They loved a particular kind of video game. They loved, more than else, the ability to kick ass. That's what they love to do. And I'm sorry to use that word first thing in the morning, but that's how they saw it. And I've heard that term, over and over and over used in Redmond, Washington. That's what these guys love. I mean, the folks who worked at Microsoft in gaming were 35 years old, going on 15. And what they loved to do was play the kind of video game where they could travel to other planets and shoot aliens and blow things up and kill their friends. And the more blood and guts and violence, the better, the happier they were. That was the kind of thing they wanted to make. And so when Microsoft said, well, we want you to create a video game console, they said, we know exactly the kind of console we're going to make. We're going to make something that is violent and hardcore and for mature audiences. And so if you want to go make something that's all about jumping through a fairy forest land, collecting magical jewels to save a princess, you can go do that, but that's not what we're going to do. We're going to make something much more hardcore than that. And focusing on that, they came up with something in short order called the Microsoft Xbox. And this thing was a huge success. It was launched in fall of 2001. And it immediately took off. It sold 24 million units worldwide, which is a huge number. It actually gave Sony a run for their money, which is a big deal considering that Microsoft had not been in this business before. Interestingly enough, this was also the first successful American game console in nearly 20 years. Anyone remember the last American game console that was a success? Atari, right? That's a long time ago, right? It's been a long time since Atari. And these guys came in, and overnight they had a success. Their signature game, Halo, which was a violent alien shoot-'em-up game, was sold out in its first weekend. And Microsoft was extremely pleased, because then they went on to make the Xbox 360, which is an even bigger success. So proud of themselves were they, that when another competitor, Apple, decided to come out with this thing, they said, we know exactly what we're going to do to you guys. They said, we're going to come after you the same way we came after Sony. So they took the same team, the same guys who had worked on the Xbox, and they said, we want you to go after Apple now. We want you to go after the iPod. Okay, and they gave them a similar amount of time and a similar amount of money and said, go after these folks because we want to show them who's boss here. And so the guys went at it, and a couple of years later, they announced their product, which is called the Microsoft Zune. Just a show of hands, anyone, how many of you have a Microsoft Zune? Yeah. How many of you have an iPod? Yeah. Yeah, it's a huge difference. You are actually a sample that belies the truth, which was that in the time when they launched, in the first 18 months, Microsoft sold about 2 million units of the Zune. In that same time, Apple sold over 84 million iPods. That is the industry definition of having your clock cleaned. Right? The Zune was actually failed rightfully so. It was a terrible experience. It was a lousy thing. It was difficult to use. One online blogger said that the installation process of using a Zune was about as pleasurable as having an airbag explode in your face. Right? That's not the kind of reviews you want to get. And at Jump, we were fascinated by this because, we said, what is the difference here between the Xbox and the Zune? Why is it that the same company, with the same people at a similar amount of time and money, and the same market position, were able to succeed with Xbox, were able to do something different, and so much so that they could get to the next model. And with Zune, they were kind of left struggling. They were left flailing. And so we spent time up in Redmond, and we talked to people who had worked on these projects, and we talked to developers, and we heard one thing over and over again that people told us. They said in so many words, they said that the biggest challenge with Zune was figuring out who we were building this thing for, because we were just running off of PowerPoints. We were just trying to go on consultant reports. But with Xbox, we knew those guys. Hell, we were those guys. And as a result, we were able to make 10,000 better decisions every day. We didn't need to stop and think about it, right? We knew it in our gut. And for us at Jump, we realized this is something big. This is an idea of empathy that is beyond just saying we're going to do a little bit of market research, or we're going to do a focus group, or we're going to talk to a few stakeholders. What Xbox had was a widespread sense of empathy. It didn't just exist with their market researchers. It was with their engineers. It was with their designers. It was even, if you can imagine, with their finance people and their HR folks. It was with their accounts payable people. Because imagine if Microsoft was starting a video game console unit and you worked in finance and you loved video games, you wanted to suddenly be part of this business unit because you had an intuition and a gut. So looking around the world, we saw a phenomenon that was particularly different for a certain breed of companies. Companies that were able to take empathy from being just an individual phenomenon to being an organization-wide phenomenon, which is to say, how do I get every single person inside of my large organization to be connected to the world around them, to have a stake in and an implicit connection with the folks who actually pay the bills, the people who buy our products and services and ultimately fund our 401ks, the people who we are ultimately beholden to for our success. And we looked around for companies that did this and found more than a few that had that widespread sense of empathy, something that was very different than what the business press was reporting. For example, if you go up to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and you spend time at a little motorcycle company up there named Harley-Davidson, it's quite an experience. Just driving up, you will see many motorcycles parked in the parking lot. And just driving up there for the first time, I remember I went up to, where visitor parking usually is, like right up front near the lobby, and I tried to get a parking spot, and I was met with a sign out front that said, Harley-Davidson motorcycle parking only, no cages. Anyone know what a cage is? Just shout it out. Anyone? A cage? Yeah, it's a car, right? That's what motorcycle guys call cars. They call them cages. Right? Because if you want to be locked in and protect yourself and not get hurt and kind of like lock yourself out from your God-given right, which is to experience the world in all of its freedom and danger, that's fine. You can do that. But that's not what this place is about. And if you just drove up in a rented Taurus from the airport, welcome to Harley-Davidson, but parking is in the back. Right? This is a company that in short order, from the minute you come to it, expresses what's important to the world. And I remember that when I walked inside, the place seemed different. The whole place kind of smelled of leather, it seemed. There was kind of gas tanks that were painted everywhere, sitting on cubicles. I was there to meet a fellow by the name of Mike Keefe, who was head of the Harley Owners Group, and he came out to meet me. He was kind of a big guy, and I remember at the time he was wearing a leather jacket. This was a marketing executive, right? And he was wearing riding leathers, and he came up, and he's like, "Hey, Dave, how's it going?" And he has, kind of salt and pepper graying hair and a goatee. He wears his hair in a braid, and the braid goes down to the back, to his belt in the back, right? I mean, a little intimidating figure. This is not what I expected when I thought I was going to meet with a marketing executive. But then we